This is the Canon M50. Here in the UK, this little Canon camera is going to cost you about £500, about $650 in the USA. And this is the Canon C200. This is my cinema camera. This is what I use for most of my professional videography work. And this camera will cost you about $6,500 if you were to buy it new. You can pick them up a little bit cheaper if you buy used, but definitely a much more expensive camera than the M50. So by the end of this video, I want to show you what difference the extra budget that goes into something like a cinema camera actually goes towards. Whether something like the little Canon M50 can actually keep up in terms of video production. If you go on to enjoy this video, I'd thoroughly appreciate if you just dropped a like on the video. It literally takes 2 seconds, and believe it or not, it really helps. So first of all, let's talk about the biggest differences here, and most obviously is obviously the size. The Canon C200 is a way bigger camera than the M50. All right, so I thought that I would actually just do a size comparison here. You can see we have the M50 just about here, this little camera right here, and then we have the C200. Bit of a cheat here, I have a lens on as well, it's a pretty big lens. But you can see that the size difference is just enormous here in terms of the cameras. Pretty massive size difference, and that's for a few reasons. The M50 is obviously built for portability and sort of just ease of use, whereas the C200 is all about the image, making sure the image is as good as possible. Believe it or not, this is actually a small camera for a cinema camera. This is still designed to be relatively portable, but of course a cinema camera has to have a nice bit of weight to it as well to shake out some of the micro jitters. That means you can get really solid handheld footage. Another real advantage is audio. I'm actually recording my audio for this video directly into the Canon C200, even though I'm using my Canon EOS R to film this video. That is because this has direct XLRs in, proper audio interfacing into the Canon C200. The M50 has basically nothing like that with proper XLR microphones. You can plug little mics in, but it's not in the same league. And battery life is an absolutely massive one. The C200 actually runs on Canon's BPA battery standards, and it means that you can have one battery and it will last you about 5 hours, which is just crazy for a camera of this level. You can bring 2 batteries and basically be covered for a full day of shooting. The Canon M50, on the other hand, uses tiny little batteries here, and they are rubbish. They literally run out in probably half an hour to 40 minutes of shooting, so you are definitely going to want to stock up on batteries if you use the M50. So we're getting into some serious differences in terms of actual image production on these cameras now. Dynamic range, if you don't know, is the amount of detail or the difference between a highlight in a shot and a shadow in a shot. So if you have lots of detail in the highlights and also the shadows, chances are your camera has a very good dynamic range. This is generally where cinema cameras perform a lot better than their cheaper counterpart, and this is definitely true using these cameras as well. I've actually shot a short little sequence here and I've replicated it on both cameras. So I'm going to run those sequences. We're going to put a camera A and camera B, and you guys are going to see which camera is which.
Yeah, when I blow up, I'ma soar high like Peter Pan. In real life, be living out my dreams. If I'm waking up, it's in a foreign land. Whole wrist covered up in ice. Dealership, never ask the price. I hit the molly ball with my dogs. Yeah, I swipe it once without thinking twice, cause this what I was made for. Man, I know this what I came for. On a big stage, couple thousand. Yeah, when I blow up, I'ma soar high like Peter Pan. In real life, be living out my dreams. If I'm waking up, it's in a foreign land. Whole wrist covered up in ice. Dealership, never ask the price. I hit the molly ball with my dogs. Yeah, I swipe it once without thinking twice, cause this what I was made for. Man, I know this what I came for. On a big stage, couple thousand.
So obviously, guys, the second camera was the Canon C200. I would imagine that's kind of probably quite obvious, but I was impressed with how the M50 did, even though if we're specifically talking about dynamic range, there is pretty much no contest here. The scene was actually quite challenging. We had this sort of a load of highlights and then not a lot of light shining on my subject, which was my friend Basil. The biggest thing here is that in these shots with the M50, all of this highlight information is just lost. You can can see that we're getting kind of basically two colors. We're getting green and then white, whereas on the C200 we are definitely getting some highlights that are lost because I had to compensate for how like dark the shadows were in this scene, but there is way more recoverable data. I actually shot this in the raw profile on the Canon C200, so you just get a load more color information, and whilst the M50 does look good, it is clearly night and day compared to the C200. So like I said, on the C200 I shot that in 4K RAW at 50 frames a second. Now this wasn't a sort of direct comparison, even though we used the same image and the same lens, because on the M50 to shoot in 50 frames per second, you actually have to shoot in 1080p. You only get access to 4K if you're shooting at 25 or 24 frames per second. That is obviously a massive deal, and it is pretty common on cheaper cameras that you're not able to shoot at 50 frames a second in 4K. But apart from that, the M50 does have a pretty decent codec support for such a cheap camera. The only real issue is that you are not getting a ton of high frame rate options, such as 1080p recording at 120 frames per second. If you want to record at higher frame rates, it's going to drop that recording time down to 720p. One advantage of using a cheaper, more slightly consumer-focused camera is that certain things are handled differently with them. Noise is a massive one here. You can see in my opening shot how noisy the shirt was on Basil, my subject. That is because the C200 is basically famous for being extremely noisy in the shadows of its images. There are of course ways to counteract this, but when you're just in a slightly run and gun situation, sometimes you can come up against a scene where it is extremely challenging. For instance, this one, there was just not a lot of light on Basil here, so I would have wanted to actually light the subject ideally, and then I could mess around with my camera settings. But in actual fact, the M50 just handled this better than the C200. You can see the amount of noise in this shot is nowhere near as bad as the C200. Of course, C200 is going to produce a better image, but chances are sometimes the M50 might actually produce a better image because the C200 image might be extremely noisy. Ease of use. These cameras are designed to be extremely easy, and it has all kinds of features built in to make that happen, such as default picture modes, picture profiles. It's got digital image stabilization you can turn on and hopefully stabilize some of your footage. These cameras are designed to be easy, and that does mean that you can produce really great images for the price with cameras like this, but they're also not super complicated to pick up and to learn. Generally, you will start out your video photo career shooting on something like this. The C200 on the other hand is designed to be used in a slightly more production environment. It is designed for use with one person, unlike more expensive cinema cameras that are literally designed to have like 4 or 5 people around the camera at all times, but it is still a lot more complicated to shoot with than the Canon M50. Another real win for the M50 is its autofocusing. It is an exceptionally good little autofocusing camera, and again this slots into the ease of use. The Canon C200 has exceptional dual pixel autofocus, and it does a fantastic job at keeping your face or your subject in focus. But the M50 actually has this capability as well, and it's still pretty crazy to me that you can get Canon's best autofocusing system on a camera like the M50. If you are shooting at 4K, it does drop dual pixel autofocus, but you still do get full autofocusing performance, but it might just be quite as good as if you were in the 1080p mode. So obviously these cameras are in two entirely different leagues, but I think you saw from the sequence that we shot at the start is you can produce images with the Canon M50 not a million miles away from something like the C200. You are of course a bit restricted and you don't get tons of data to play around with in post, and you can't rig your camera out to within an inch of its life and really change the way you're going to create images on the camera, but sometimes you don't necessarily need all that, and it is still a fantastic little camera to get involved with video production or photography, especially if you are on a cheaper budget. The C200 is one of Canon's slightly more affordable cinema cameras, but it still just produces an absolutely incredible image that even if you're shooting in, for instance, 1080p, if you pair that with a good lens, you can just produce an image that is absolutely beautiful. And for some reason, it's very challenging to get a look that looks quite as good on these smaller consumer level mirrorless DSLR-like cameras, even though they might have similar specs for video. That sort of wraps this one up, guys. Let me know what you think down below in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time.